There's a question that philosophers, psychologists, and historians have been circling for centuries without ever quite landing on it directly. Not why do we have enemies? That's the easy version. It's because of misunderstandings, greed, fear. We blame the conditions, the leaders, and we blame the times. But the harder question is what if we need them? Not in the cynical political sense, not in the sense of what if someone is manufacturing enemies for profit? Though that's also true, and we'll get there. I mean, something deeper and more uncomfortable than that. What if the human mind, at a level below ideology and below culture and below whatever beliefs you think you hold, what if it is structurally dependent on having someone to push against? What if peace, as we imagine it, total, universal, permanent, is not just difficult to achieve, but is in some fundamental sense against our nature? That is the question this essay is actually about. And I want to be honest with you upfront. I don't have a clean answer. Nobody does. But I think asking it clearly, looking at it without flinching, changes how you see almost everything happening in the world right now. So let's just start with the brain. Because before this is a political or a philosophical problem, I think it's a biological one. The human brain is not a neutral processor. It is a threat detection machine that learned over hundreds of thousands of years that the most dangerous thing in your environment was usually another group of humans. The mechanism is called in group out group cognition, and it runs so deep that it doesn't require meaningful differences to activate. In the 1970s, the social psychologist Henry Tasfel ran a now famous series of experiments. He took strangers, divided them into groups based on something completely arbitrary, a coin flip, a preference for one painter over another, and then watched what happened. Within minutes, people were favoring their own group, allocating more resources to members of their team, judging the other group's work as inferior, building a quiet, low level loyalty to people they'd never met based on a category that had been invented an hour ago. He called this the minimal group paradigm. The finding was bleak and important. You don't need a real enemy to activate tribal psychology. You just needed them. This isn't a flaw. It was, for most of human history, a survival feature. The group that stayed loyal, policed its borders, and identified threats quickly, that group survived. The one that didn't was absorbed or destroyed. The problem is that the hardware hasn't changed, but the world has. And we're running ancient threat detection system on a planet that looks nothing like the one it was built for. Here's the deeper layer. The enemy isn't just a threat to survive, the enemy is a mirror. This is the philosophical core of the whole problem, and it's been sitting in plain sight for 2 centuries. Hegel argued that the self is not something you simply are, it is something you become through encounter with what is other than you. Identity in his framework is fundamentally relational, it requires friction. Carl Schmitt, darker, more brutal, writing in the shadows of collapsing democracies in the 1920s, put it more directly. He said the fundamental political act is a distinction between friend and foe, not good and evil, not us and them in a moral sense, just this is my group and that is not. He argued that without this distinction, there is no politics at all, only administration, process, and management. The enemy is not an obstacle to political life, the enemy is what makes political life possible. Now, Smith was a Nazi apologist, so we should hold his ideas with a degree of contempt. But the uncomfortable thing about a disturbing idea is that being disturbing doesn't make it wrong. Think about it at a personal level. How much of what you believe about yourself is defined in opposition to something? I'm not like them. I don't live like that. I don't believe what those people believe. Strip away every knot, every contrast, every opponent in your self conception, and ask how much is left. There's a third function the enemy performs, and this one is particularly uncomfortable because it is so useful to people in power. The enemy unifies. The sociologist George Simmel observed in the early 20th century that conflict is not simply the opposite of social cohesion, it is in many cases a producer of it. Groups that face external threats become more internally bonded, more cooperative, more willing to sacrifice individual interest for collective survival. War is the most extreme version of this. Historians consistently note that nations at war experience steep drops in internal crime, spikes in communal trust, floods of voluntary solidarity. The Blitz didn't break London, it made London in many ways more itself. This is not an argument for war, it is an observation about a mechanism, and that mechanism gets exploited. Every leader who has ever needed to distract from economic failure, political scandal, or institutional rot has reached for the same tool: point outward. Name a threat, construct an enemy visible enough to feel real, credible enough to generate fear, distant enough that the audience can't easily inspect it. It works because the underlying psychology is real. The manipulation is effective precisely because it is plugging into something genuine. And the genuinely disturbing part, you often can't tell in the moment whether the enemy being named is real or manufactured, because the feeling is identical either way. Here is where we are now. The traditional vessels for enemy thinking, rival nations, colonial others, religious heretics, class enemies, have either collapsed or become morally illegitimate. Overt tribalism is at least officially socially unacceptable in most of the world. But the psychological need didn't go anywhere, so it mutated. It found new hosts, smaller, more intimate, more personal. It moved from the nation to the culture war, from the battlefield to the timeline, from the border to the comment section. The enemy is now someone who voted differently from you, someone who holds different opinions about diet or gender or television show, someone algorithmically served to you specifically because your engagement spikes when you see what they believe. The platforms didn't create this. They didn't install the need. They just discovered that the need was already there, already generating heat, and built a business model around it as efficiently as possible. The result is a civilization with all the psychological infrastructure of tribal warfare: the in groups, the out groups, the loyalty tests, the ritual humiliation of defectors, but no actual war to absorb it, just the energy, endlessly recycled, making everyone feel perpetually threatened and perpetually righteous. That is not an accident, it is the ancient mechanism running in a context it was never designed for, pushed to its limits by systems that profit from keeping it active. So, what do we do with this? The optimist's answer is we consciously redirect the need. Choose better enemies: poverty, disease, climate. Channel the tribalism toward problems rather than people. Some traditions have tried this: the war on cancer, the fight against injustice with partial success. It's not a bad instinct, but it hasn't worked at scale. And I think we should be honest about why. Abstract enemies don't generate the same heat. You can't make a face for climate change. You can't feel contempt for a virus the way you feel contempt for a person. The emotional circuit wants a someone, an agent, a consciousness that chose to oppose you. The pessimist's answer is nothing. This is just what we are. The question is naive. We should build institutions strong enough to contain the damage and accept the rest. But I don't find that satisfying either. The honest answer, the one I keep coming back to, is that we don't actually know. We have not seriously tried at civilizational scale to examine this need clearly, to sit with how deep it runs, to stop pretending it belongs only to other people, the extremists, the fanatics, the ones we've identified as the problem. Well, I don't have an exit from this. I don't think anyone does yet. But I suspect that whatever the exit looks like, it begins with that moment of recognition, the slight vertigo of catching yourself mid construction, enemy in hand, and asking, do I actually need this? Or have I just never tried living without one?